Do you want to play Yu-Gi-Oh but you're on a budget and don't know where to start? Well, look no further, because in this video I'm going to bring you some amazing budget Yu-Gi-Oh decks at every price point. How's it going, everyone, and welcome to another video. Today we're going to be talking about budget decks in Yu-Gi-Oh! Now, I could have just brought you a regular old top 5 best budget decks, but I feel like for budget decks especially, I should try to be a bit more inclusive of other people's potential definition of what budget actually is. For example, for me, a budget deck is around that $100 price point, but for others it might be $30 or $50 or maybe even $150. It really depends. So for that reason, I want to bring you some amazing decks at each of those different price points to show you can build a really solid Yu-Gi-Oh deck at that price. And with Battles of Legend Terminal Revenge officially available, there are so many more amazing budget decks out there. But I do have to say, there are some decks you're going to see on this list that may not be considered budget. But if you remove some not super mandatory cards, they are still really solid budget options at the different price points, but they do get better the more you invest in them. And when I do get to a point in the video where I talk about a deck that is missing a key component that is not necessarily in the strategy, I'll point that out and explain to you how you can actually make the deck better with time and more investment. Oh, and I'll be posting a deck list for each strategy I mentioned today. And if you want to see a tier list on where I'd rank the top 25 or so best budget decks, then make sure to leave a like on the video. If this video hits 250 likes, I'll bring you that tier list. Also, subscribe to the channel for more amazing competitive Yu-Gi-Oh videos. Only about 15% of my viewers are actually subscribed, so if you don't want to miss a single upload, then make sure to subscribe. But with that being said, here are some awesome budget decks for every price range for the June 2024 competitive Yu-Gi-Oh format. Let's jump into it. So the different price ranges I'm going to be talking about in this video are going to be $30, $50, $100, and $150. And for you, a budget deck might be at that $50 price range, and for another person, it might be at that $150 price range. Just keep in mind, different people have different definitions of what budget is, and I'm trying to be as inclusive as possible. I'm going to talk about 3 different decks in each of these categories, but if you have more decks you want to hear from, let me know down in the comments. But with that being said, let's start off with our $30 price range. And our first budget deck we're going to be talking about today is going to be Trap Tricks. Trap Tricks is a very heavy trap-based strategy, just as the name would suggest, but it also relies very heavily on their Link monster Trap Trick Sarah to consistently gain them additional card advantage. You can build the entire deck for around that $30 price range, while still including around 9 different spaces for non-engine pieces, including the best hand trap for this strategy being Infinite Impermanence. Now that's saying something because a playset of Imperm goes for $15 right now, so considering that Imperm is half of the budget for our deck of Trap Tricks cards, it's a pretty low-cost deck. Pretty much every single card I'm showing you comes in the Trap Tricks structure deck, but if you really want to take the deck to the next level, I'd highly recommend picking up 3 copies of Parallel Exceed, which make the deck just that much better. Also, because of Rarity Collection 2, you can actually pick up Access Code Talker as a budget option, which is a great way to OTK your opponents. And the path to upgrade Trap Tricks to a more competitively viable deck is pretty straightforward. You definitely want to get Ash Blossoms if you didn't pick up the structure deck. You also want to grab probably Solemn Judgment to protect from back row hate, as well as Divine Arsenal AA Zeus as a great board wipe, and of course down the line you can look at potentially grabbing the Ragnaraka cards for more powerful plantling strategy. Considering that you can get this powerful deck for around $30, you'd be in a great place to start your Yu-Gi-Oh journey. Next up for the $30 category is Ninjas. Now Ninjas are a really cool deck, with their main gimmick being that they try and set your opponent's monsters face down over and over. Now this does a few really cool things. First off, because the monsters are face down, they can't be used for any extra deck plays. They also can't activate their actual effects because they're not on the field face up to be able to use them, but arguably most importantly is that they're not actually being sent to the graveyard or banished where they can have a secondary effect actually activate. The problem is, that does kind of play into Link monsters, which are really popular right now, and that means they can't be put face down, so they're kind of immune to Ninja's best form of removal. But the entire Ninja core is incredibly budget. The most expensive Ninja card is like 40 cents at most, which is crazy, so we have so much room for just good, solid non-engine cards. Focusing on some really good generic hand traps is always going to be a great idea, but because Ash Blossom and Infinite Impermanence are each about $5 a copy, you can only get one playset of those cards. You can eventually get the other playset you really want to, but for the time being, at this $30 price point, just picking up 3 Imperms or 3 Ash should be enough. And like I said earlier, setting cards face down can be really good to prevent people from getting to Link monsters in the first place. So you really want to take advantage of cards like Book of Moon and even Sol and Luna from Rarity Collection 2, which can basically Book of Moon opposing monsters if given the right situation. The deck is able to access some really cool extra deck options including Appaloosa, but the main card is going to be Mazen. This card allows you to attack your opponent directly with your ninja monsters to close out a game pretty quickly. And the path to improve the deck is also very straightforward. You want to pick up your missing copies of Ash Blossom or Imperm, whichever one you didn't decide to go with. You also want to grab copies of Pot of Prosperity for extra consistency, and of course Destructive Daruma Karma Cannon, which is just a better version in every way than Sol and Luna, and also acts as removal too. And my last deck at the $30 price point is going to be Zombies. Now Zombies are a really fun deck that can do a lot of really cool things. The constant threat of Doom King Baylor Drosh for a negation is really scary, but also the fact that Zombie World being up on the field a lot of the time is incredibly good at beating so many different strategies by changing their types to zombie monsters. And with some combos you do end up locking yourself into zombie monsters, it's not that big of a deal because it's not going to be all the time. And on the crackback you can always go into cards like Appaloosa for negates or even Access Code Talker, both of which are around 50 cents to $1 now that they've been reprinted in Rarity Collection 2. But the path to upgrade this deck isn't so straightforward because every single engine card is already in the strategy at this price point. So I guess what you're really missing is going to be better hand traps. So picking up copies of Ash Blossom and Infinite Impermanence would be really nice, but I'd also recommend getting Crossout Designator just in case. This is the kind of deck that you can buy, play and enjoy for a good while you're saving up for more staple generic cards that you can use to then reduce the price of more decks over time. Now are Trap Tricks, Ninjas, or Zombies really going to be a threatening meta deck in the format today? Definitely not, but for $30 you can do so much worse than what we put together for you today. But moving on, we enter the tier for $50 decks, starting off with Raid Raptor. Now Raid Raptor is a really cool strategy that was a lot more expensive in the past, but now it is pretty easily accessible at that $50 price range. It's also really good because there are so few decks playing kaiju type monsters in the format today, and considering that Raid Raptor really wants to set up a bunch of towers monsters to force your opponent into really tough positions, that plays into Raid Raptor's advantage. For those of you who are new to Yu-Gi-Oh, a towers monster is going to be a monster that is immune to opposing card effects. And that's basically what Ultimate Falcon and Rebellion Falcon really are. And that's the deck's main gimmick, to set up multiple towers type of monsters. Now that combo can be pretty weak to some hand traps, but at least that's what we thought before Raider's Wing. Now Raider's Wing is a great card where while it's attached to a monster as Xyz material, it can't be targeted by card effects, like Infinite Impermanence, Effect Veiler, or Ghost Mourner, which are all really good at stopping this deck's main combo at its worst choke point being on Raider's Knights. But there is something else about this list that's really interesting, and that's that we actually have a side deck now. Having a side deck in Yu-Gi-Oh is so incredibly important, especially if you're going to be going to your locals every once in a while. Now the fact that you're looking to spend $50 of your hard-earned money on playing Yu-Gi-Oh, I assume you'll be looking to play in person at some point at a local shop nearby. Having that side deck will give you a better chance at competing against these top tier decks, while also shoring up some of the weaknesses of your strategy and potentially even giving you chances to get prizing as well. And as far as a path to improve this deck, I'd highly recommend getting just better hand traps. So of course, Ash Blossom and Infinite Impermanence are the main two. You also probably want to get Crossout Designator to further protect you from hand traps in case you don't have Raider's Wing. And also, you're probably going to want Forbidden Droplet as a great board breaker for this strategy as well. Keeping up with our $50 tier, we move on to Fire King Tri Brigade. Now, fire decks in general have been dominating Yu-Gi-Oh for the past 6 months or so, and Fire King Tri Brigade is no exception. It's performed pretty well over the past couple of months at different events, but it's nowhere near on the same level as Snake Eye fire decks. That being said, at this price point you can take advantage of the insanely powerful Fire King engine, which can constantly recycle back bodies, get you negation and powerful destruction effects as well. On top of that, you have the Tri Brigade monsters, which can help you extend to really awesome Link monsters including Appaloosa, but most notably Shureg, especially on the opponent's turn thanks to Tri Brigade Revolt. And at that $50 price point, you can still pick up a really good side deck as well. Now, is the side deck going to be absolutely perfect? No, it's not. You're going to have to make some concessions at this price point, including picking up Ash Blossom or Infinite Impermanence, which has been the trend so far in this video, but that's where I'd start upgrading this deck. You definitely want to improve your hand trap lineup as much as possible, or your board breaker lineup if you go that route, but you also should pick up Pot of Prosperity as well. this card is incredible in this specific strategy to find the cards you really want to start your combo. But our last $50 deck is going to be Exo Sister. Now Exo Sister in 2024 is more than anything a shifter deck. Sure, they can play without it, but it's really at its best once it can resolve Dimension Shifter, especially against what the meta is looking like. It's got really cool options for removal thanks to Vadis and Returnia, as well as Michaelis and Magnifica, and pretty much every single main deck Exo Sister monster also acts as a way to disincentivize the opponent from actually using their graveyard in the first place. But one of the biggest downsides for this deck is that it's kind of xenophobic, where you're not really going to be using other generic extra deck pieces in this strategy, which means you're not really saving up for future decks down the line. Now that's perfectly fine because Exo Sister is a really solid and fun deck to play, but if you want to eventually take these cards and pivot to another strategy, it's going to be a bit more difficult. But you can still play a good amount of non-engine, and Exo Sister will constantly come in and out of the format as time progresses. And if you want to improve the deck, the best ways to do so are going to be to, of course, shore up your hand trap lineup, but also pick up Pot of Prosperity, which is amazing for consistency in this strategy. And down the line, I guess if you really want to, Triple Tactic Thrust is nice, but it's again not super mandatory. So I'm skipping the $75 tier for a few reasons, but the main one is going to be that you can take pretty much every deck that I've mentioned so far, add in better non-engine pieces, and your deck will be still really good at a $75 price range. So if you pick up a deck like, for example, Tri-Brigade Fire King, and make sure you have your Pot of Prosperities and both your Ash and your Impermanent, all your good generic staples at that $75 price range, you can have an amazing deck. And that's what I'd recommend doing. Get an engine that's going to be relatively low cost, and then build your non-engine with any extra budget you have so you can take that non-engine and move it to different strategies whenever you're ready to invest a bit more. But let's move on to our $100 tier, starting off with Runic Stun. Now, is this deck a particularly fun deck to play or play against? No, it's not. But is it good? You bet it is. Being a stun deck, it has a really interesting place in the format today, where it tries to grind the game to a halt to make sure these over-the-top decks that are really good at comboing off kind of have to play at its own pace. And it's really good at doing that thanks to the runic cards to constantly gain an additional card advantage, while it relies on a lot of really annoying and difficult to deal with floodgates, like Synchro Zone, Rivalry of Warlords, Gozen Match, and Tikaboo. The only thing I'd really recommend to improve this deck over here is picking up maybe a copy of Typhon, which is around $40 a copy right now. But down the line, you may want to consider grabbing SP Little Knight, but obviously at the time being, SP Little Knight is more expensive than the entire deck list I've shown you so far, so it's definitely going to be a future project. Also, this entire deck I'm showing you right now is about $85 in price total, which means you can use that extra $15 to invest in more generic hand traps for future formats. But another great deck at $100 is going to be Sprite. Now, for the better part of 2 years, Sprite has been a pretty expensive strategy in the format. On release, Sprite Blue was like $95 and it's settled down quite a bit, but it still was around $200 at least to play the strategy. Now, thanks to Battles of Legend, Terminal Revenge, and all the Sprite reprints, you can play the entire deck for well under that $100 price point. But that's not all. Terminal Revenge also gave us Mirror Mage of the Ice Barrier, which is an amazing card for Ice Barrier, but also for Sprite. Not only is it a level 2 monster, which Sprite loves, but it's also an Aqua monster, which means that you can now get access to Totally Awesome once again. What you're going to do is summon out your Swap Frog, use the effect to send the Mirror Mage to the graveyard, use its effect to add Freezing Chains of the Ice Barrier to your hand, use that card to then revive back the Mirror Mage, overlay to Totally Awesome, and then you can go ahead and do all your Sprite combos with an awesome Omni Negate as well. And one of the best parts about Sprite is that the engine is also incredibly small. You can pair it with the Frog engine, the Nimble engine, the Adventure engine, or even something like the Melfi engine, and still have room for a ton of non-engine cards to be able to stop your opponents. Now, unfortunately, Dark Ruler No More is gaining a lot more popularity once again, and that card does tend to shut down Sprite pretty hard, but the deck is still very good nonetheless. And if you want to upgrade the deck even further, I'd recommend cards like Pot of Prosperity, which is amazing for consistency. Kashtira Fenrir is a great option for just good annoying removal and just being a big body that doesn't conflict with any of your Sprite cards. You also probably want Typhon, and eventually you definitely want SP Little Knight in this strategy. It's not mandatory, but wow, this card is amazing in Sprites. And finally, the last deck I want to talk about at the $100 price point is going to be Pearly. Now look, you can easily build Pearly for that $50 to $75 price range, but the reason why I have it in this specific tier is because I really want to emphasize how good something like Crossout Designator is in this specific deck, with cards like Ash Blossom of Court, Infinite Impermanence, and then all the other hand traps in the game today too. Pearly is just a very solid deck all around that can do some really cool things, but in the hands of a good pilot, it gets so much better. Now, the most expensive card in the entire Pearly list is easily Zeus. Everything else is less than $5, and if you don't include hand traps, it's around like, what, $3 or less? It's a super solid deck that can perform very well in the hands of the right pilot. One of the main game plans for Pearly is to set up Expertly Noir with a ton of materials attached to it and play a control style of game, but they can also OTK pretty easily thanks to Happiness as well. Now, based on the list I have for you over here, the main cards I'd recommend to pick up are going to be the second copy of Zeus, but that's kind of optional. You probably want the third copy of Prosperity, as well as a Typhon and potentially an SP Little Knight as well. But moving on to our final category today, we are talking about the $150 category. Now, I understand that for some people, $150 is well above budget, but I do want to cover this just in case. That being said, our first deck in the $150 tier is going to be Melodious. Melodious is a very fun deck to play, but even at this price point, we are making some concessions to what cards we're including into the strategy, and that's because First Movement Solo is a $25 card. Because of that, I was only able to fit in 2 copies of it into this list, which in the grand scheme of things is fine, but you definitely want more in your strategy. The extra deck is also basically fully ready. The only card you really want to see here is SP Little Knight, but again, it's not mandatory in any way, shape, or form for this deck. Over the past couple of weeks, basically since Legacy of Destruction's release, Melodious has been performing pretty well at multiple different events. And one of the best parts about this strategy is that you can take the Melodious engine, the core Melodious engine with the new cards being your 3 copies of Refrain, your 3 Ostinato, your 1 Couplet, your 1 Concerto, and your 2 Bacca, and be able to set yourself up to create a really powerful board before even committing to a normal summon in other strategies. It's a great choice for a starting player if you're willing to invest that $150 price point. But our next deck in this price range is going to actually be Branded Despia. Yeah, look. Branded Despia is not known for being a budget deck by any means. I mean, 1 card, Guiding Quem, is a $50 card right now, and usually you want to play 2 copies. But I've actually managed to brew up a really strong Branded Despia deck at $150 with only 1 Quem. Really, the only thing you're missing from this deck list over here is going to be that second copy of Quem, and I guess your triple Tactic Thrust, and while it's nice to have them, for the time being, you can rely on Crossout Designator and just additional copies of Fusion Duplication. And granted, 3 copies of Thrust and 1 Quem will probably cost you around $200, it's still going to be a very strong and fun deck to play in this format with the current list I've shown you. And honestly, as long as Branded Fusion doesn't get hit, even if we lose Albion the Sanctifier Dragon and all the gimmick puppet locking shenanigans, you can still have a really good deck for a long time coming. And finally, our final deck I want to talk to you about today is going to be Marincess. Now look, Marincess is a deck you can get also for a very low cost, but I really want to make sure you had a very well built and strong deck that didn't really need to add anything else to it. So Marincess at the $150 price point, or honestly that $110 to $140 price point, is going to be a really strong choice. Marincess is a very fair deck, and the Marincess core itself is well below $150, but when you start adding in those non-engine pieces, that's when it starts to creep up in price. Marincess can set up an awesome end board with a really powerful monster that a lot of decks have a hard time outing, and they can back it up with a ton of hand traps as well. Now, certain decks will have a hard time against this strategy, especially because they can always use the Zelantis lock against them too. While they lock themselves into water monsters, they use Zelantis' effect, and because they can't summon back anything but water monsters, the entirety of your opponent's board gets banished permanently, which is great. With the list that I've shown you, you do not need to add anything to it. The only thing you could possibly maybe want to have is triple Tactic Thrust, but even then it is not mandatory in the slightest. This is an amazing option if you have $150 and you want to play competitive Yu-Gi-Oh! And there you have it, 12 awesome decks, each at a different price point of budget. Now obviously, budget's definition varies from person to person, so if a deck that is $100 or more is not budget in your opinion, focus on the decks that I've talked about that are below that $100 price point. But what is your favorite budget deck? Let me know down in the comments. And of course, leave a like on the video if you enjoyed the discussion. We're trying to hit 250 likes on the video, and once we do, I'll bring you a tier list with the top 25 or so best budget decks in Yu-Gi-Oh! Also, if you haven't already, make sure to subscribe to the channel. Only about 15% of my viewers are actually subscribed, and it's the best way to make sure you don't miss any content. Check me out on Twitter and join the Discord server, both of which are linked in the description. And I want to thank my channel members as well for going above and beyond and supporting the channel. Thank you all for watching, I hope you enjoyed it, and I'll see you all next time.